Hey everyone, welcome to Season 3 of the What About Grief podcast. I'm Larry Holm. It's kind of hard to believe that what started as an idea in my head during daily walks trying to cope with my grief after losing my wife Sarah in 2021 has turned into a monthly podcast. I have to admit, it was a crazy and intimidating idea, jumping into something like this with absolutely zero podcast experience or knowledge. But when my life turned upside down in so many different ways after Sarah's passing, I learned I had strengths that I wasn't aware of. So I decided to stretch those muscles and see where this podcast would take me. So first off, thanks to all of you, the listeners, for joining me on this journey. And thanks as well to our wonderful guests who have been willing to share their own grief experiences, knowledge, and expertise with such openness and generosity. And a quick shout out to BAM Studios and Matt and Jess, to TED Studios for the design logo, and of course my good friend and producer Marcia, who I couldn't do this show without. Now, I'm not an expert host by any stretch of the imagination, but my guest this month very much is. I got to know Cara Banks in Florida after she moved across the pond from England to Orlando to be one of the hosts on Golf Channel's show Morning Drive. I have had the pleasure of directly working with her every once in a while during my own tenure at Golf Channel. And we recently worked together covering the Paris Summer Games. Skills as a presenter and reporter aren't limited to just golf. She works on coverage of English soccer's Premier League, skiing, and back during her days in London, she covered Wimbledon, among other sports. As much as I wish we were going to speak about her career in sports broadcasting, we are rather here to discuss the loss of her younger brother, Myles, back in 2009, while the family was on a Christmas holiday in Switzerland. Last summer, when we were working on the Paris Olympics, I asked Cara if she would want to come on the podcast and speak about the death of her sibling, her grief from his loss, and how she and her family have coped with and still deal with Myles' absence. So with that, welcome to the podcast, Cara.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, not a delight in a way to be here with you, because it's kind of sad that we all have this thing that unifies us. But I think as you are learning and as lots of us have learned, there is so much good that comes from tragedy. And this is one of them. So congratulations on everything you're doing, because I think it's a wonderful topic and it's good that you're getting the word out.
Well, I appreciate it. And thank you for coming on. And I got to ask you, will it feel strange to be on the other side of the interview answering questions and not asking them?
I know. I was going to say, you said you're not an expert host, but you sound like one. Normally I get the easy job, but this is, it's not like I needed to study. This is my life, and it's very personal. And honestly, I'm always open and happy to share. It's not something I throw down people's throats, but I feel like this can be a sensitive topic and people are never really sure. But my attitude has always been like, talking is the best therapy, and I'm always willing to be open.
Well, thank you. I can safely say your job at NBC is not in jeopardy by me asking the questions. Well, let's get started. First off, tell me about your younger brother, Myles. What was he like?
Oh, he was my best friend, really, which, I don't think you realize at the time. You're sort of bickering siblings growing up, but it was just the two of us. I was the annoying, older, bossy sister. And my mum would always say that Myles wished he was the older child. But we had a wonderful upbringing, a wonderful family life with my mum and dad. And we were just sort of in this bubble. You just kind of, life's pretty perfect, but you don't realize it until it's not. But he was a very tall, probably 6'7", I think, at the time he passed. Tall, good-looking, athletic, sporty guy, kind of on the cusp of starting the next stage of his life. He just graduated from university and was just about to start his first job in January of 2010. And he was just a good time guy. Liked to have fun, liked to play sports, liked to be with his friends. And it was just a big chunk, a big chunk of our family.
Yeah. And you and your family had traveled to Switzerland for many years to celebrate the Christmas holiday. So explain to us what happened to Myles the night and the early morning hours just a couple of days before Christmas 2009.
Yeah, sure. So just to set it up a little bit, my mum went to school in Switzerland. So I grew up with my dad as a golfer, my mum's a skier. We all know I work in golf. I'm doing a bit of skiing now. But so those were kind of our two family sports. My mum went to school in Switzerland, so her side of the family really have a bit of a second home in this ski resort called Wengen in Switzerland. It hosts the Laberhorn every year on the Men's World Cup, so people in the ski racing world know it for that. But it's a very quiet, sleepy, pedestrian-only village. And whilst we never had a permanent place out there, we would just rent apartments or whatever it might be. But it was like our place. Every Christmas, that's where we go with all my mum's side of the family friends, a big English and Irish community out there. It was kind of a home from home. And actually, still is. So we would go out every year, and it was our favorite place to be in the world for all of us. You know, my dad only learned to ski when he met my mum, but we would go out. And this one year in particular, we drove, the four of us. My brother was 23, I was 25, but the four of us would get in, I think, a Volkswagen Passat estate, like back suitcases, ski boots, the whole thing. My dad having to go how much I'd packed, you know, and we drove because it was just an easier way to travel with all the ski kit. And that year in particular, it was just a horrible drive from Calais to Switzerland because there was just winter storms driving across France. It was just like a really grueling drive for my parents. Anyway, we got there, and because Wengen is a pedestrian-only village, you park the car in this garage, and then you get a train from Lauterbrunnen, which is like 10 minutes below Wengen, and everything gets on the train, and then you're in Wengen. I vividly remember that year being at Lauterbrunnen train station and my dad like cracking open a little hip flask of whiskey. Like, we made it, you know, now I can relax. Yeah. We're here. Anyway, so it was also kind of a big deal that year because my mum sadly had a couple of bad ski injuries. She used to run a lot of ski races, and she'd had quite a devastating pelvic injury from a racer. It had taken her a long time to heal. This was going to be her first time back on skis. They'd also told my brother that he was going to get to, they were going to give him his first pair of skis for Christmas for him to own rather than rent. So he was so excited to go out and test skis that week. Anyway, so, you know, we get there, we're in our apartment. We had our first full day skiing as a family of four, which was a big deal because my mum was back on skis. And then we had dinner that night in our apartment, you know, nice family meal. And then our friends came over and us young went out, as we always do. And we went to the bar, and me and my brother's doing Jaeger bombs and whatever. And as you know, he was probably a bit more of a boy drinker than I was. And then we went out to a nightclub like we always do. And at like 1:30 in the morning, I was like, night, bro, I'm going to go home. Boring older sister, but it's 1:30 in the morning. So I went home, and we were in a 2-bedroom apartment with my parents. And the room that my brother and I slept in was 2 single beds, kind of alongside a wall. So our feet almost would be touching, if you will. And I vividly remember walking in that night, and I kind of opened up his bedding for him because he'd always come in after a few drinks and wake me up. So I was like, I'm just going to sort out his bed so he doesn't wake me up. And then that morning, the next morning, I opened my eyes and I thought, that's so strange. Myles didn't wake me up last night. And I sat bolt upright in my bed, and I could tell his bed hadn't been touched because of how I'd specifically prepared it for him. Right. And then I heard my mum out in the kitchen of the apartment, and I said, is Myles out there? Because sometimes he would sleep on the sofa in the kitchenette so as not to wake me up. And she said no. And that basically was the start of a week-long search for him or his body or who knew. It was a mystery, basically. And it was so uncharacteristic of him. As I said, he was so happy. He was kind of on the cusp of starting this next stage of his life. He wouldn't have wanted to run away. He wouldn't have wanted to commit suicide. You know, all the things that the authorities ask you when they get involved. It was just bizarre. And so we went out to look for him. My mum and I remember, walked down the high street, and we're looking in like snowdrifts in case he'd passed out or something in the snow. You're kind of grasping onto any kind of thing, hope that you can. And ultimately, obviously, contacted the authorities, and the police came. And there's lots of theories people think of what might have happened. And it was just a really harrowing experience straight away because, you know, sniffer dogs came in the apartment to smell his clothing, to go out and try and find the scent. And Obviously very intrusive, but very bizarre that we couldn't find him. And obviously we're calling his cell phone and there's no response. And that night, my dad said, he's dead. And my mum and I are really eternal optimists. And we were like, don't be ridiculous, Dad. Like, he was like, I know he is. I just know it. Yeah. And we were like, I mean, this is a bit strange, but surely he'll show up, like something, you know. And this kind of snowballed, honestly, into a bit of a media frenzy, ultimately. The British press found out about it, flew people from the British tabloids out to Switzerland.
Really?
And kind of chased us. My dad's a tall, 6'4" bald man. He's quite easy to spot. There were pictures of all of us from Facebook accounts and things in the press. You know, we would be chased down the street by reporters. But at this point in time, we were kind of advised to get the word out there because we don't know where he is.
Right.
Maybe he's been kidnapped. I mean, it's unlikely, but, you know, who knows? And I will say the one really gratifying thing was that we were in Wengen. We weren't in a ski resort where we didn't know anyone.
Right.
We were in a place that felt like home. And so we had the support of our family and our second family out there, of our friends. And ultimately, it was our friends that would go on to find him because sadly, and that first night, I will never forget the sound of helicopters circling the valley. And they're looking for my brother's body. It's kind of a chilling experience, but and you think it's too early. That's not, you know, this isn't going to be the outcome. Ultimately, the authorities then wanted to kind of sweep this under the carpet because they didn't want to hurt the tourism industry that really thrives in this ski resort. But our friends obviously understood the anguish that this causes us and anybody who would be going through this, and they organized independent search groups with people that knew the mountains and the valleys incredibly well. Meanwhile, my younger cousins are printing out pictures of Myles and sticking them on all the stores on the high street, the ski rental shops, the pharmacy. You couldn't walk down the high street and not see his face. And it was like we were these weird celebrities in a way that we didn't want to be, obviously. Right. So that happened on the 21st of December, and it went through Christmas week. And little things you remember, like when you go on a ski holiday, you don't really pack clothes to wear during the day. You pack ski clothes and you pack, you know, evening clothes to go out for dinner in.
Right.
And, you know, just little things. You have to find this kind of black comedy in the madness. And my dad and I would turn to each other and be like, I don't have any clothes to wear because I didn't plan to spend the whole week like walking around the ski resort. Weird moments like that happened. But ultimately, after a week, on the 29th of December, I got a phone call on my mobile, and I picked it up and I went, Myles? And they said, no, come to the tourist office. And the tourist office was just candlelit. And as soon as we walked in, the other people left and his body had been found. But it had been found by our friends at the bottom of a 300-foot cliff in Lauterbrunnen, the place that we got that train from, where we parked our car. And to this day, we have no idea, Larry, how he got there, why he was there, really how specifically he died. I mean, the post-mortem showed that he had a pretty drastic head injury, probably from the fall. And I think that's been part of the journey for us and my parents particularly, is no real answer. But the place that he would have fallen from is like a 20-minute walk out of town in the wrong direction, which we had never been to. And it was a slippy night. I remember falling over when I walked home from the nightclub, you know, in the early hours of the morning that night. But from where his body was found, he would have had to have walked 20 minutes to a place that, as far as I'm aware, he'd never been to. And then he would have had to have fallen through a forest of trees that then dropped off to a cliff. So that's the long-winded story.
Yeah. Does it, I guess, help or not help that you don't know really the answer to how he passed?
Well, it's a good question. I have dealt with it by just because I realized when this happened, nothing's going to bring him back. So
Right.
obviously not immediately, but in time you realize I've got to find a way to process this. And for me, it's been for some reason, who knows, he wanted to go on a walk that night. And he lost his footing and he fell. If you ask my parents, and my dad particularly, I think he'll always think there was some foul play at hand, which is harder to come to terms with.
Yeah.
There was one CCTV image of him leaving the nightclub with a group of people, one of whom we knew, the others were maybe locals that we didn't know. And there wasn't really any other traces. He walked one of our friends back to her hotel that was like 200 yards from our hotel. So how he didn't then get back into the hotel where our apartment was is just a bit of a mystery.
Can you kind of compare the feeling of not knowing where he was initially to then being told his body had found? What was kind of going through your mind during that 8-9 day period?
I think as those days progressed, you kind of came to the realization that my dad knew more immediately from his gut. And it actually turns to wanting to find the body because you felt, and I felt quite protective of my parents, honestly, but you felt like if this was going to be the result, you want to find a body. And it actually got into that stage that we just were hoping to find a body to at least have some kind of closure. I don't know if it was a big story over here, but in the UK years prior, there was this big story about Madeleine McCann, this young girl that was kidnapped from a hotel in Portugal. And it was this massive story across Europe, massive story. Her parents were all over the media all the time, to the extent that my dad said, I don't want to go down this route, but we had to try and find him. They never found her, never found a body. It's always kind of an unanswered question. And obviously there's several awful stories that we hear of. So in the end, I think we were grateful to have found him, to have at least had an answer to a story that you wish was never written, but at least to have some sort of closure.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the arc of your grief journey after, Myles' body was found and you go back to London. Describe how you've coped from those early initial days following his death to now 16 years later.
I know, it's crazy how time flies. And I've always said time is a healer and for anything in life, it is. But obviously those first few days back home are just lonely. There's the three of us and there used to be the four of us. We sit down for dinner and nobody's sitting in his seat at the table. Moments like that are just hard to stomach, but that just naturally get easier with time. The letters that poured through the door, people, friends, anyone offering their condolences and support, which was so wonderful. But I remember receiving a letter from a girl I went to university with who'd also lost her brother in a tragic accident and offering her help. And I remember being so unaccepting. Like, I don't want to be part of this club. I don't want to be, I don't want to admit that that's happened to me, but it has happened to me. And I think after a couple of weeks, really, I can't remember how long it was, I just wanted to get back to work. I was working at IMG in London, sports production company at the time, and I just wanted life to try and get on as much of. I just wanted life to get back to normal as quickly as it could, or the new normal. I wanted to get some sort of a routine. It's not that I wanted to ignore what had happened. I just felt like I couldn't sit around the house crying my eyes out reading letters every day. That wasn't going to get me anywhere.
Yeah.
So I had to get back to a routine and I had to get back to some sense of normalcy.
Did the grief change the dynamic at all among you and your parents?
Not really. I would say my mum and dad dealt with their grief, probably, and still do, very differently. I think, we all know as a parent, your your biggest fear is to outlive your children. And then there's the concern about what it does to your relationship. And I think we were all very aware of that. They dealt with it very differently in the sense that my dad wears his heart on his sleeve, very emotional, would cry at the drop of a hat, even, just would let it all out. And my mum would be much more stoic and hold it in and kind of be a pillar for the family and say, Dad needed to go to therapy and he needed to talk to someone. But I think in the long run, that probably helped my dad more because he got it out and he released, and my mum maybe tried to be the pillar of the family, as perhaps is in her instinct, and didn't grieve as much as she maybe should have done.
Yeah.
For me, my friends were the answer. Talking to my friends was my therapy. They'd call me every day and ask how I was, and I would just be very honest. And that I found a huge healer. And they all knew him. They knew him.
Right.
That he was their friend too. And I think they were grieving in their own way. And I think that really helped.
Yeah. You mentioned time is a healer. What are some of the things that you can share that have altered your grief besides time? Obviously, you said you wanted to get back to work, and now you're married and you have 3 kids. And does all of that help you? Or how did that kind of getting back to, like you said, the new normal help you with your grief?
I'll never forget that when Myles died, there was obviously there's a wave of different emotions you feel. And one of them was, for me, selfishly, I don't have a sibling anymore. And I still feel that today, honestly. And I just thought, and I look at my dad and his sister. My mum has siblings too. My dad and his sister are so close. And I'm really close with her and my aunt. And the same with aunts and uncles and cousins on my mum's side. But I just remember thinking, I don't have that relationship anymore. And nothing can replace that relationship. And my future kids won't have an uncle on my side. Woe is me. But, really, is that the be all and end all? But obviously to me in my little world, it is. And I've lost a huge part of my life. So later on, a few years later, I met my now husband, Ollie. And he's 3 years younger than me and actually would have just been a few months younger than Myles. And I feel like, and I've always felt like, he is my Myles fairy because he would have gotten on with him so well. I would have been, it actually would have annoyed me as to how well they would have got on. Right. They would have been such good friends. They would have been playing golf all the time. And obviously it's gutting that he never knew Myles, and he's obviously heard a lot about him. But what's become so wonderful is that Ollie has become really good friends with Myles's mates from university. He went to Newcastle University like me, and he had this core group of friends who he went on a golf trip with every year. That golf trip has now become the Myles Tour, which Ollie is a part of every year. And one of those guys, Nick Pritchard, is now godfather to our second child. So it's kind of a weird full circle moment that I feel Ollie is a bit of a bridge in a way that he doesn't even know that he is, because he never even knew Myles. But, that's been a bit of a healer for me. And then we just welcomed our 3rd child last year in March, coming up to her 1st birthday. And it's kind of because of that emotion I had very early on that I knew I always wanted to have 3 children. Which is a weird thing to say because, of course, you never expect to lose a child. My parents never expected for this to happen. But I just felt like if there had been 3 of us, I'd still have someone to share this relationship with, which is a ridiculous thing to think because there are only children and there's people who have 4 or 5 kids. It doesn't necessarily make a difference. I just knew that I wanted to have 3 kids for that reason. And God forbid, you pray that nothing ever happens to anybody. But, Ollie shared that same vision. And I never really, I don't think, expressed that to Ollie. But in my head, I kind of just felt, I don't know if it was trying to fill a void or what it was.
It's a comfort to you because it's important to you and you know the reason why you want to do it, right? I mean, it maybe it's healing in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's weird now because, look, our kids are still young and our oldest is just in kindergarten. He's 5.5 and they don't really get it yet. And I haven't really tried to explain it to them because, death's a bit of a scary concept, obviously. But it does upset me that they don't have Uncle Myles and they don't have that on my side. And Ollie is one of 2 as well, actually. So he has a younger brother, Barney, and Uncle Barney is a big part of our lives and his son and fiance. So they have that, and they're beyond blessed, and they wouldn't know any different, and it's wonderful. But quietly, I think it will always be a bit of a hole for me.
You're listening to the What About Grief podcast. We will get back to the conversation in a moment, but I wanted to remind you that you can write to us at the show with your thoughts, ideas, or a description of your own grief journey. We appreciate hearing from you, and we like being connected with our listeners. So please reach out to us via email at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com. Also, if you like the podcast and find it helpful, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. Hit the subscribe button and leave a review. All of this helps us grow the podcast and helps new listeners find the show. And share the link with those you know who are experiencing their own grief. The goal of the podcast is to help those like us navigate the confusing emotion that is grief. There are days when I can go through it without really grieving, or thoughts of grief of Sarah come into my mind, but then all of a sudden a food smell will come into my mind, or a song, or a TV show, or anything, and I will get ambushed by grief, and it'll take me down. I'm wondering, 16 years on for you, do you still kind of get a ambush by grief, and it just takes you back to 2009?
I wouldn't say I get ambushed as much now. And of course, my relationship with Myles was so different to your relationship with Sarah, which I can't begin to fathom either, because of your everyday life. At this stage of my life, I probably wouldn't have been speaking to my brother every day. Naturally, our lives would have gone in directions and we would be in touch as and when. But back then, there was a song that someone sent me, a friend from work, and it was called "The Day I Died Was the Best Day of My Life." And it felt so poignant because it probably was one of the best days of his life. He was testing out new skis, went for dinner, went out with our friends. He had a wonderful girlfriend who I haven't mentioned called Sophie, who was going to come out to Wengen to spend New Year with us. And that song comes on sometimes, and that takes me back a little bit. And there's another song from his memorial service. But I will say there was one moment that I won't forget that was quite soon afterwards. I was working early years of my career in the golf industry, and Myles was a massive golf fan. And he went to Charterhouse when he was at school, which is one of the schools that do the scoreboards at the Open. Charterhouse does one of those big yellow scoreboards, and Cranley does another. Myles had done the scoreboards at the Open the summer before his death, and his favorite player in the whole world was Luke Donald. I don't know why, but he was. And he came home from the Open that year with the Donald massive yellow plaque from the scoreboard.
That's so cool.
We had this Donald plaque, like this massive yellow plastic Donald name in our house. I was like, what are we going to do with this thing?
That's great.
And then I was just starting out really in terms of my flexing, I suppose, learning different roles in the golf industry. And after going back to work, I was sent out to travel quite a lot. I was doing this role at the time where I was kind of a self-producing, editing, one-man band on the road. And we were going to the PGA Tour, the European Tour, wherever it might be. And I'll never forget, actually, my first gig back, my first trip after, I think it was in the February, honestly, like just over a month after everything had happened. I went to South Africa for 2 weeks on my own for work. And my production manager sat down and cried with me. She was like, I don't want you to do this if you're not ready. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you with your parents. And, everyone was very aware of what had happened. But I went and it was good, and I knew I wanted to do it. Anyway, in the March, I came to Florida and I went to the old WGC at Doral. And it was the first time I'd been to an event of that stature. And I'll never forget, I was walking down the driving range and I saw Luke Donald. And I was like, oh my God, Myles would love this.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
And I wanted to just pick up the phone and call him.
Yeah.
And then there's that ambush.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't pick up the phone and call him anymore.
Yeah.
Hits you.
Do you look at the yellow scoreboards now when you're at an Open, and does it kind of remind you of that story?
Yeah, it's kind of a happy memory. And actually, as serendipitous as it would be, I don't think I've ever really told Luke this, but I then met Ollie, who was working at IMG, which is where we met. He was in the clients division, And would you believe it, was looking after Luke Donald. And Ollie was, Ollie was his road manager for the year that he was world number one. So Ollie was on the road with Luke like the whole time. And I was on the road quite a lot filming with Golfing World, who I was hosting content for then and producing. So I got to know Luke fairly well, and Dad and his family and his brother and sister-in-law. And it was just like, if Myles could see us now, you know, and if Myles was still alive, how he would just love to be part of this. Yeah. It's kind of crazy how things play out.
Well, I will never look at the yellow scoreboard or Luke Donald. I'll totally look at it differently now and remember Myles. Obviously, Christmas time is an interesting time for you and your parents. And, you know, I mentioned at the top of the episode, you know, you'd still cover skiing for NBC. And I'm wondering around Christmas time and when you go to cover a skiing event, what thoughts come into your mind because those are so intertwined into what happened to Myles?
You know, it's a great question, Larry. And we didn't go back to Wengen the year after this happened, obviously. And we kind of questioned what our relationship with Wengen would be because arguably it took Myles away from us. But I think we realized that he would be devastated if we never went back to Wengen because it was such a big part of our lives. And so 2 years later, we went back again at Christmas. A little unsure probably as to how we would feel. And I had met Ollie by then, but he didn't come with us that year. And I actually felt closest to him there. I felt like that's where his spirit is, in the mountains in Switzerland, where we left him. So I love now going back to Wengen. I love skiing. It's where, as I said, I feel closest to him. We don't go to Wengen now as much as I would like to one day because we have very young kids and my mum sadly is ailing and can't really get out there, but we will. And Ollie fell in love, fortunately, with the place as much as I did. And he actually proposed to me in Wengen.
Oh, wow.
And my family kind of thanked him and just said, thank you for bringing such a happy memory.
Yeah, that's really sweet.
To follow on about the ski events, it's the same thing. It's like, wouldn't he be so proud to see that I'm here?
Yeah.
And I wish I could share it with him. I think that's the hardest thing, which I'm sure that you feel, is you just have to hold it in, stuff that you would pick up the phone to do, send them a message, send them a photo. I think that's what hits you, is that you can't share something that you enjoy so much with that person anymore. Yeah,
future memories stolen, right, from us of our loved ones and doing things with them and dreams that we all had. That's a tough one for me, future memories that Sarah and I were going to do and build as a couple. So I totally understand that.
How have you found it with photographs, looking at photographs?
You know, it's funny. The other day, January 8th is Sarah's birthday, and a couple of her girlfriends came down from Minneapolis, and my sister and her partner, and we all went out for dinner in downtown Chicago, and we celebrated Sarah. And then a couple nights later, they came over to my place, and I picked up Sarah's phone. I go, you know, if you guys want to look through her photos and share them with, you know, text them to yourself, feel free to. And they're like, well, let's put her phone up on the large screen TV and let's go through Sarah's phone and her photos. We stopped when, you know, she got cancer. We didn't want to relive that part, but we relived like all the happy times that we had with Sarah and looking at these photos. And it was such a healing thing for me, and I think for the four of them as well. We were laughing, and there were videos where you could hear Sarah speak and laugh, and I hadn't heard that, you know, in a while.
Right.
So it was really fun to do, like to just take her phone. Can you imagine someone taking your phone and throwing it up on a flat screen TV and just, you know, going through something that, you know, can be personal, I guess. But it was a lot of fun, and so I love seeing photos. I love when people come up and tell me stories about Sarah because I feel like I get to know her in a different way. If, you know, she worked at Golf Channel, as you know, and she met so many people. And, I would walk into a compound after she passed away and people would just tell me stories about her or going out with her after the show. And that was a side to her that I didn't know. And so I'm still, learning about Sarah, which I think is really, really neat. I'm sure maybe
Isn't that great? Yeah.
your Myles friends might have told you the same thing.
I think it's crazy that it's crazy how much you learn about someone after their passing.
Yeah.
And it's because of the person they were and the friends they had. And one thing that my parents did as we settled into this new normal is they host a big lunch every Sunday. And we lived in London, so we were close to a lot of his friends. And they would invite all of his friends around every Sunday. It may have been once a month rather than every week. I can't remember. But we would just have kind of an open door policy and we'd tell his core few guys, put this out on your text groups or whatever. And anyone that wants to come over and have a glass of wine and chat and be with us, please do. And we had these like epic Sundays that Myles would have been proud of.
Yeah.
And we learned so much about him from listening to his friends talk about him. But the reason I asked you about photographs is we had so many pictures up in the house. And then I moved into an apartment in London that actually Myles and I were on the cusp of buying together. We were buying this apartment together and we were going to close on it like January 4th when we got back from this ski trip to Vegan. So a bizarre situation that I ended up following through and managed to purchase on my own. But I had all these pictures of him around the apartment. And I'll never forget when it became normal to get used to not seeing him, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because you think, oh, he's just away, he's at school or he's at university, I'll see him soon. Because we'd both been to boarding schools, we'd been at university at different times. I was used to not seeing him every day. But then it's like when you look at the picture and you realize, oh, yeah, he's not here anymore. And I haven't seen him for a long time.
Yeah, it's tough. And that could be a grief ambush, right? Like, that's tough. Yeah. This life sucks sometimes.
Yeah.
How do you, and I'll extend this to your parents maybe as well, if they do something differently, but is there anything specific that you all do to remember Myles on his birthday or the anniversary of his passing? You mentioned also that I think you started a charitable trust in his name. How do you remember those days, those couple of days?
So the company that he was contracted to start work with in the January were incredibly supportive. And they suggested that we start a trust in his name and they would help us run the financial part of it for 10 years. So we launched the Myles Trust and it focused on a couple of things. One was skiing and snowboarding to people that may not have access to it. And one was he had done a trip to Africa, to Ghana, much like I did in his gap year, a year off between school and university. And we sponsored projects out there. And there is a plaque on a wall in a school out in Ghana with the Myles Trust name on it, and a well in another town in Africa that we built with funds from the Myles Trust that we would sponsor projects with through these charities. And we did that for 10 years and we had some incredible fundraising. We had an annual golf day every year at the Berkshire in England, which is where my parents play. My mum ran it. I think it actually really helped my mum. I think this was a way for her to channel her grief. She threw a lot of her energy into the trust. The boys still do their annual golf tour, but that's more for memory's sake rather than raising money for the trust. We had a couple of annual balls, like a big gala, the Myles Ball, we called it, that I ran with one of his best friends, Will Poole, which were these kind of awesome big black tie events in London. And I think in the interim, in the more immediate aftermath, it really helped a lot of us. And then after the 10 years, I think my parents just felt like it was time to close the book on that chapter. Yeah. It took a lot out of them and they were aging and the company wasn't going to necessarily help run be the board for the financial component of it. So that chapter is kind of closed now, but it was, I would say, quite healing at the time because it gave us all like a sense of something to put our energy into. One thing that happened after he after he died and we found his body is I felt very passionately that I wanted to bury him. I didn't want us to cremate his body because I couldn't fathom doing that to him. And this was something that I really had a stronger feeling about than my parents, I think. And I wanted us to have a place to go. I wanted us to have a grave. I felt like it was really important for all of us. And so we have a grave, and it says on it his name and his years of life. And it says, a candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long, because he lived life to the full.
Yeah.
And that grave has been a place that my father particularly goes to a lot. It's 10 minutes probably from where they live. And on his birthday, which is in December 4th, he goes every year and he puts a plant there, a Christmassy type plant on the grave. And he used to go there a lot in the early days and talk and write, and found it very healing, I think. And he'll always send me a picture when he's there.
That's sweet.
And a couple of years ago, I took our oldest to the grave. And I don't think he quite understood what was going on, but it meant a lot to me that he could see it.
Yeah, that's great. After I started this podcast, when I would walk into a TV compound or go into the office, people would pull me aside and share their grief stories because as you probably know, it's a tough subject, and I don't think we as a society maybe really talk a whole lot about it. And with you being in the public eye, being on television, I'm wondering if people who might know your story and Myles' story, do people come up to you and kind of share their grief with you, knowing what you've been through?
They don't really, Larry, but I think that's because they don't really know, or maybe they don't feel comfortable to ask, because I guess the difference is for you, there are so many people in your life that knew Sarah, which is so wonderful. For me, it almost feels like another lifetime ago. I was at such a different stage in my life. I was 25 and single, not married, living in London. My life now is very different. If anybody ever wants to ask me about it or talk about it, I'm very happy to be open. Kelly Tillman actually lost a brother as well, and we connected over that a little bit at the Players' Championship one year in the TV compound trailer that you know well.
Yep.
But I think, the people in my life now don't necessarily even know, to be honest.
Yeah.
And that's not because I'm hiding it. It's just because I think it makes it a bit awkward to shout it from the rooftops. But if people ever ask or it comes up, I of course share the story.
Yeah. Let me ask you this to kind of wrap up. I recently have been spending some time at the storage unit, and I've been kind of going through some of Sarah's boxes from her years growing up back in Minneapolis, well before we were dating. And I'll open up these boxes with different pieces and aspects of her life, like her teenage crush on 70s pop singer Sean Cassidy, or papers she wrote for school, or just the regular kind of knickknacks that we all keep as we grow up. And they kind of not only made me appreciate and love Sarah more, but like I kind of said earlier, I got to know her in a new and different way before I had ever met her. And, we never really went through these boxes much, as they were just kind of taped up and they just moved with us as we moved around the country. And so I have like a new relationship with Sarah that is ever evolving because I've opened up this new avenue of her life. And, we would maybe speak about some of these things, but we never really delved into them so much because they were just so early on in her life. And every once in a while, if something funny comes up, I'll say something out loud to her that I know she would have laughed at, or I feel like I need her by my side to kind of get me through a certain situation. I'll talk to her. And so it's ever evolving, this new relationship with Sarah since her death. And so I guess my question to you is, do you have kind of a new relationship with Myles since his passing?
I would say a little bit, but again, it's a slightly different relationship.
Sure.
I used to dream about him a lot, and I still do. I don't know if that's something that you experience.
I haven't had a dream about Sarah since she's passed away. Maybe once, but no, not often. And I'm kind of questioning why.
I used to dream, yeah. And obviously you can't control it. I used to dream that he wasn't, that, he was still alive. I used to dream that this elaborate story about how he went missing for a while and then came back. Part of you still believes they're going to come back. Part of you still hopes that you're going to wake up from this and they're going to come back. Even though my life now, as I said, as a wife and a mother, is very different to what it was when I was 25 years old. But there are moments I have where I think that was Myles. Ollie was one of them. And then a couple of years ago, we now live in Connecticut, as you know, and we went back to England for Christmas. We had 2 kids at the time, 3 and 1. And we walked back in our house at 10 o'clock at night after an international transatlantic travel day with kids to Niagara Falls, what can only be described as a catastrophically flooded house. Water was cascading through 4 or 5 ceilings on our ground floor.
I heard about this.
Right.
Yes.
Disaster.
Yes.
Okay. And, ended up at our neighbors that night, massive insurance claim, ended up in a rental house for what was 18 months, really moved back in this summer. But you know what? We really, really needed to renovate that house. And it's one of those things where you get comfortable. When are you going to get around to doing it? Life's busy, young kids, work, travel, but, the list goes on. And I wasn't pregnant. I didn't have a newborn. And I felt like it was him pulling the carpet from under our feet and saying, get on with this, guys. Because if you're not going to do it.
That's great.
There's just little things like that happen that you think, this isn't ideal, but actually it's not the worst. This actually is going to end up being for a good reason. Yeah. We're going to make this work. And I feel him in ways like that.
That's great. Kicking you in the butt.
Yeah, get on with it.
Yeah.
There's only one way to make this renovation happen.
Yeah, it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, but get on with it, Cara.
Yeah, cheers. I know, cheers. Yeah, so I kind of talk to them a little bit like that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, because they can't talk back to us. So, we have the upper hand.
Oh, yeah, it's very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
Well, I thank you so much for coming on the podcast and giving us a glimpse into Myles. He seemed awesome and still is in many ways. And I think this will be so well received by the listeners. And I appreciate you being so vulnerable and sharing from the heart.
Thank you, Larry. And I think we have to take strength in, look, they're never going to age in the way that we hopefully will. So there's a certain way that we can remember them. But I think also there's an interesting amount of questions that are posed to us when we go through something like this. And you think, and I know Sarah went through a journey, you both did, that meant this wasn't an immediate moment like it was for us. But you think, people say to you, he lived his life to the fullest. He went out with a bang in all sense of the word, but he didn't, could he have been suffering for years? And it's a hard one, isn't it? You have to try and take positives from where you can.
Yeah.
And know that they had a happy, wonderful life. And I know it was the same with Sarah, and she'd be so proud of you doing this and pouring your heart and soul and energy into something that's a really important topic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate those words. And next time I see you, let's toast Myles and Sarah.
Let's do it. It's a date.
All right. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry.
When trying to figure out how to put a period to this episode, I found this passage from Mark My Words on Instagram and felt that this is something my late wife Sarah might say to me, assuring me, watching over me, and cheering me on. Maybe you will relate to it, and the words might be what you have been feeling, but you were never able to spell them out like this. So take a listen. I'm sorry that I had to leave you. I hate watching you miss me and cry. But please don't spend too much time being sad, and don't spend too much time questioning why. My death showed you that tomorrow isn't promised. So live and enjoy life while you can. And when you feel sad thinking I'm not with you, please don't ever doubt that I am. I'm with you in all your big moments. I've seen everything that you have done. I'm so proud of everything you have achieved, and so proud of who you've become. Don't worry about all the things you didn't say. Don't feel guilty whenever you feel happy. I promise you I'm okay now. So don't feel guilty for living life without me. I'd hate to think my death destroyed you. I want you to be brave and carry on. Although I'm not physically with you, the love we shared could never be gone. So don't worry about what we didn't get to do, because you can do so much with your time. And always remember, when you think of me, that love can never, ever die. Remember, if you are experiencing grief, you are not alone. My thanks to Cara Banks. What About Grief is available monthly on all major podcast listening platforms. Please follow the podcast, as well as rate and review the show on Apple Podcast. The executive producer of What About Grief is Marcia Anderson. Logo artwork was designed by TED Studios. This episode was recorded at BAM Studios in Chicago. And lastly, feel free to email us at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com.